Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Noah Ganner, the President and CEO of BookNet Canada. Welcome to Book Industry State of the Nation 2021. In the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to touch on a lot of our current research, much of it looking back at 2020, but some also looking forward at the first part of 2021. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to recognize that BookNet Canada acknowledges its staff, board, and partners work upon the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Huron Indigenous peoples, the original nations of this land. We endorse the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and support an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. If you haven't already, we recommend you watch the opening ceremony video with Elder Wabagoon of the Lac Seul First Nation. You can find the link in the reminder emails for this session or contact techforum@booknetcanada.ca and we will happily send it to you. With that, let's get started. We'll primarily be looking at data collected through BookNet Canada's research and education initiatives today, but a reminder that we operate many products and services for the marketplace here in Canada, and you can check all that stuff out at booknetcanada.ca. As I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on our research initiatives. We gather data from a bunch of different areas. So we gather data from the collection of bibliographic data, the collection of POS or sales data, of library circulation data, and then we do surveying on our own. We do Canadian book consumer surveying, reading and leisure time survey, and ad hoc surveys when things pique our interest or pique the interest of the industry. So I'm going to pull data in from a lot of these different sources today to give our state of the nation. But I'm going to start where I normally start and where I think it's important to start, and that's with some new data that we just got a little while ago, and also with our leisure and reading data. So each year in January, we survey adult English-speaking Canadians about their reading behavior and how they're spending their leisure time. Why do we do this? Well, we want to know a few things. We want to know how many people are reading, and we want to know this because both from a cultural and business perspective, this is our audience, or part of it for sure, and it's important that we as an industry know if actions we are taking, i.e. new formats, new delivery mechanisms, new marketing techniques, are changing how many and how people are reading. We also want to know how factors external to our industry might be impacting how people spend their free time. Do they have more or less time to devote to leisure activities than they did in the past? Are they spending that time reading? This year it was very interesting to see the impact of the pandemic on reading and culture and leisure behavior. On purpose, we didn't change our survey this year from the previous year, as we wanted to focus on how people's reading behavior changed because of the pandemic, while also not hinting to them about the pandemic. A fine line to walk. So let's get started and see how their behavior may have changed. 40% of respondents this year said that their amount of leisure time had increased in the last year. This was a fairly large increase in the amount of people who said this from the year before, when it was only 17% of respondents. Also, 36% of people said that they had more than enough leisure time this year, up from 26% the year before. So people had lots of leisure time. How are they spending it? How are they spending it in 2020? Well, it shouldn't come as any surprise, but they were spending it on activities that were either at home, could be done at home, or at least close to home, with a corresponding decrease in activities that required people to leave their houses or leave their neighborhoods. So what does this mean? Well, leisure activities that saw a large increase year over year, the largest increase year over year, were working on crafts, playing video games, and listening to podcasts, all things you can do in your own home. Correspondingly, the leisure activities that saw a decline in behavior year over year were dining out, spending time with family, and shopping, obviously areas that required you to leave your house or required people to leave their house. Watching TV was the most popular leisure activity, with more than 9 in 10 Canadians say that they watch some TV at least weekly, and 7 in 10 Canadians watching on a daily basis. That has remained remarkably the same year over year. TV is often the number one leisure activity for Canadians. What was of standout interest this year was the huge growth in video game playing. So this chart here is from the Entertainment Software Association of Canada, and they said that although the pandemic has not resulted in substantial new video game consumers, with less than 2% of adult Canadians deciding to take up a controller for the first time during the pandemic, it has significantly boosted the amount that existing video game consumers played in Canada. It's a little different than what our survey showed. Our survey did show a fairly significant growth in the number of video game players amongst readers and amongst Canadians. This may be because video games this year, more so than any other year, took on a very social aspect. Among Us and other video games, you could play from the safety of your own home, but you could play with your family and your friends online. So there's a big social aspect to video games that's maybe not apparent in some of the other leisure activities. And again, subscriptions may have played a role here. Across much of the leisure activities, we've seen a growth in subscription behavior. So in video games, there's now the Apple Arcade, Google and Microsoft all have subscription opportunities, just like we've seen in the video streaming area. So people seem to have had a lot of leisure time, and they seem to have been spending on activities at home. What about finances? So this question we ask is, thinking about your finances for the last year, please select a statement that best describes how you selected the majority of the leisure or free time activities you participated in. So this is a little more polarizing. More respondents said that they had no restrictions on the money they spent on leisure, up 5% year over year. However, 5% more respondents also said they had more restrictions on their leisure spending. So both ends of the continuum increased, and these increases were all from a corresponding decrease in people saying they were limited spending within their budget. So once again, while it was far from clear-cut, it would appear that adult Canadians had more free time and the budget to spend on leisure activities in 2020. So did they spend it on reading? Maybe, maybe a little. In our survey, 80% of adult English-speaking Canadians said that they read or listened to a book in 2020. That really hasn't changed at all over the last 5 or 6 years. Roughly the same. 8 in 10 Canadians said they read or listened to a book last year, and that is pretty much the same that we've seen for the last 5 or 6 years. So while leisure time increased for a large swath of Canadians last year, that did not necessarily translate into a lot of new readers, or at least book readers. 54% of Canadians said they read at least weekly, and 33% said they read daily. So what about those 8 in 10 Canadians who are readers? Did they increase their reading? Well, maybe a little. 42% of readers said that the amount of book reading and listening has increased in the last year. And again, once we look at the frequency of readers, we observed a very slight increase from 2019 to 2020. 43% said they read daily, a 2% increase over 2019, and 68% said they read weekly, about a 1 or 2% increase over 2019. So how does that reading break down? Well, we can look at a lot of different ways. And this is actually from a different survey. This is from our Canadian Book Consumer Survey. So this is a survey of 12,000 Canadians. So the percentages will be a little bit different here. We'll spend more time on this study in a few minutes, but I just thought it was interesting to pull out the reading activities here. So as you can see, the 2020 numbers are in the blue bars, and you can see there's a slight tick up on all of the reading activities that people participated in, with the exception of reading print magazines, which was down about 3%. Now, these are not large increases year over year, but they're just percentages. And remember, this is breaking down by particular activities, so we'll see smaller percentages than the 80% we saw overall. So we saw increases in reading of ebooks and digital items, and audio and print magazine, pretty much across the board, with the exception of digital magazines. So back to our leisure and reading survey for a moment. What format did people read? Well, most people continue to read print books. They may read other formats at the same time or in conjunction, but the primary format that people read is print books. So 93% of our respondents said they read a print book. That was down 3% year over year. Well, ebook was up 3% to 64%. 64% of our readers said they read an ebook, and about 50% of our readers/listeners said they listened to an audiobook, and that was down about 3% year over year. We also asked about format preferences from our readers as well. And while we did see a slight tick up in digital reading, we didn't see any corresponding tick up in the preferences for those digital formats. So 65% of our respondents said they preferred print books, 16% said they preferred ebooks, and 8% said they preferred audiobooks, with 11% specifying no preference. And theirs was no change from the year before, 2019. So we also ask readers how they acquired the books that they got. So 81% of readers said they bought a book last year, and 55% of readers borrowed a book from a library, a public library last year. And when we break that down a little bit more, it looks something like this. So there's a lot going on here. This is the percent of readers who said they acquired these formats from these particular outlets. So about a fifth to a quarter of books were mostly acquired from a library, a public library last year, and about the same for online retailers, as you can see that here. And then when you break it down by format, you can see that about 22% of readers mostly acquired their books from print books from a public library, and 25% of ebook readers did the same from a public library, and 20% of audiobook readers got their books from a library. So you'll notice there's towards the free and illegal online, there's about another quarter of the digital formats another quarter of digital format readers who acquire their books from free sources. So those may be YouTube, they may be public domain, and then there are some people who do tell us that they get their books from torrent sites and other areas like that. The other area to call out here that saw significant growth year over year was the number of readers to the very right-hand side there who got their books in from subscription services. So this is now, at 12 to 14%, depending on the different digital formats, and this was primarily Prime Reading, Kobo Plus, Audible, etc. But we have seen that grow quite a bit year over year. So, like a lot of media consumption, it seems that people really like subscriptions. So, something probably worth exploring going forward. How about we look at year over year and just pull out the print books, because this can be a little much. So again, this is the percent of readers who said they acquired their print books from these different channels. And what we're seeing here is the difference between 2019 and 2020. 2019 is blue, 2020 is red. So you can see the growth in online retail acquisition of print from 16 to 24%. So almost a 10% growth in the number of readers who said they acquired. A corresponding decrease in public library, obviously for print, since public libraries were impacted by the pandemic, and many of them were closed for parts of the year in 2020. And then not as much change in the other areas. What's interesting too is that the physical bookstore, primarily new physical bookstores, didn't see a huge change. So a little bit down, which is interesting. And I think that probably has a lot to do with curbside pickup and local delivery. We'll talk a little bit about that coming up, but retailers did tend to change how they were doing business relatively quickly, and that may be showing itself here too. So how did so we've talked about how these readers acquired their books. How did they discover them? So we asked, what are the 3 ways that you generally discover the books of any format that you read or listen to? So the number one way that readers discover the books that they read or listen to is through word of mouth. And this is about 34% of our readers check this box. The next one is in the bookstore. 26% of readers say they discover their books in the bookstore. The next one is library. 25%, a quarter of our readers say they discover their books that they read in the library. That's tied with online bookstores at 25%. And then 22% of readers say they discovered the books via social media. The ones that we saw the biggest change of year over year, word of mouth stayed exactly the same between 2019 and 2020, but we saw decreases in bookstore and library discovery, in physical bookstore and library discovery, primarily because the pandemic, and these outlets were closed for portions of the year, so we saw a decrease in discovery from there. So it's a challenge, obviously, that the industry needs to tackle. But we saw corresponding growth in online bookstore discovery and social media. So that seems to pick up a lot of the slack for the physical outlets being closed, that the people were going to social media and obviously browsing online bookstores and discovering the books they wanted to read there. So something to pay attention to going forward. So we've talked a little bit about that the reading rate was relatively flat. There was not a lot of growth in reading, although we haven't seen that in quite a few years. At least it didn't go down. Um, so let's look at the book market in Canada and see how that flat reading rate may have affected sales. We'll start by looking at some of our overall sales data from 2020 and then look at some Canadian book consumer behavior from our ongoing survey work to inform this. So let's start with sales data. So a reminder, sales data is a service operated by BookNet Canada. We collect print book sales from approximately 2,500 retail outlets across Canada. And these are retail outlets of all types: independent, wholesale, online, mass merch, general merch, specialty, and they all send us each week their sales. And so we get a very good view of the market. So just to give you an idea of the size of the Canadian print market, the green number there is the number we tracked in sales data. So $1.1 billion in retail spend in 2020. The blue number is from our sister organization, BTLF, and is the Quebec trade sales number. Our number, the green number, represents about 80 to 85% of print book sales in the Canadian marketplace. The Quebec number, the BTLF number, represents about 55%. They have a smaller panel. I'm not going to focus on the Quebec one. I am going to focus on the green one. So here's what the sales look like for 2020. So this is from January 2020 to January 2021, broken down relatively by weeks. So the blue line is 2020 and the kind of yellowish orange line is 2019. So you can follow along there and see the sales per week throughout the year. So there are really three time frames on the graph above that are worth looking a little more closely. So the first one is the dip, or the big dip that happened in March, April, and May. So we'll focus on that one a little bit. The second one is the recovery period that happened mid-June, beginning of July, through the rest of the summer. And the third period that's worth focusing a little bit on is the gift giving season, or the holiday book buying season, which was a little bit different this year, as you can see from the graph here. So we're going to focus just briefly on each of these to kind of give a view of 2020 and through the pandemic. Very interesting here. So let's look at this one first, the dip in March and April and May. So this is focusing on that March period a little more closely. So you can see this graph goes from January to September. So on this graph, you can see the changes in unit sales by month for the overall physical English language book market in Canada for the first part of 2020. Unsurprisingly, due to COVID-19 necessitated retail closures across Canada during spring and early summer, sales were down a total of 24% for this period, with some weeks being down as much as 44% year over year from 2019. In a bit of good news, as stores began to open, sales began to bounce back significantly. So remember, stores closed March 16th, pretty much across the country, or right around March 16th across the country, and went from having people in the stores to having to pivot their businesses relatively quickly. So we're going to focus a little bit on this, but that initial down was a huge down, and we have never seen anything like that since we've been tracking sales. So quite significant for the retailers and the publishers and the marketplace in general. So I'd like to focus maybe a little more positively on the recovery period, which as I mentioned before, kind of started towards the end of June, mid-June, beginning of July. So that's this period in here in the summer. And so here, once again, I focused in on the period of July to September, the summer period. And again, the blue line is this year, or it was 2020, and the yellow line is 2019. So you can see by week again, the increase we saw both after the initial lockdowns ended and also after, as I mentioned, after retailers changed how they delivered books to consumers. So it took a little while, obviously, but by end of May, beginning of June, we saw retailers of all types start to do a lot more curbside delivery, local delivery, a lot more online book selling across all channels in that period. So, and also there was some opening up of the retail sector again in different areas across the country at different times over that period. But it was a very, very good summer period for book sales. The quarter was up about 6% year over year from the previous year. Also should be mentioned that in this time was a lot of the anti-racism and social justice, Black Lives Matter movements happening throughout the summer here in Canada and the US, gaining a lot of media attention. And there was a lot of books sold in these subject areas over that time, enough that it can cause the market to lift up a little bit. So we're seeing a little bit of that impact as well. And just pent up consumer demand when consumers couldn't get books in the spring, they pushed them to the summer. So let's look at this last area of the year here, the gift giving season or the holiday season. A little bit different this year than other years. So I've focused in again a little bit on this area. So what you're seeing is the time from kind of the beginning of October through December. So normally at Christmas, as that yellow line indicates, we see the market almost triple in size. It goes from somewhere around 1 million units sold on an average week to almost 3 million sold. We just didn't see that this year. So comparing 2020 to 2019 is quite interesting. It looks like book buyers got a bit of an earlier start to their holiday shopping in 2020, with sales starting to tick up in the second week in November, a week or two, or maybe 3 earlier than the norm when looking at sales in 2019 and 2018. We didn't really get our traditional December spike. We did get a bump, but the bump was there, but it was much more smoothed out over a longer period of time. And we heard this from multiple consumers. This was a result of a couple things. One, people did their shopping earlier because they were concerned about stores staying open. As we know, Ontario went into lockdown on December 26th, so there was some concern by consumers that that might happen earlier. Also, a lot of shopping was done online this year, so that those online books, people bought them earlier to make sure that they were shipped in time for Christmas gifts or holiday gifts. So that's really what we saw. So all in all, for 2020 through the pandemic, our market was down in the stores that we measure was down about 2.7% from the previous year. Not bad at all, considering what was going on. So we would consider that to be relatively flat year over year. What does it look like by subject categories? Well, here are the BISAC top level subject categories. So the green is the all market, which I mentioned was down 2.7%. Fiction market was down 9%, and the nonfiction market was down 5%, and the juvenile YA category was completely flat. So nonfiction and juvenile YA did not see the decline that fiction did, partly because of educational content and other kind of lifestyle and living and meditating and self-help books. Those areas did very well this year and helped pull those subject categories, the top level subject categories up year over year. We'll touch again on fiction books in a second. Another way of looking at those graphs I just showed is here is the breakdown of sales by quarter. So Q1 is the top bar, and it was down about 5.6% in units. Q2 was down almost 17% year over year in units. And Q3 was up, 5.5, almost that 6% I mentioned, and Q4 was up 2.5%. So we bounced back quite well in the last 2 quarters of the year. Didn't quite make up all of the down in Q1 and Q2, but definitely did quite well considering all that was going on. So what were the bestsellers? So here are the best-selling Canadian authored books for 2020. Lots of new stuff here that came out just last year, but some older stuff as well. All did very well. We often see Love You Forever in this top 10 and have for many, many years, but all did very well. And Canadian authors accounted for about 10.6% of our units sold. This is based on bibliographic data we get from publishers. That accounted for about 5.6 million units sold. And you can see a sample of some of the Canadian authors here. So moving out of Canadian authors for a second, what were the best-selling nonfiction books for 2020? 3 are political related. Half are not from 2020. So half of the best-selling books in 2020 were actually backlist titles, or at least mid-list titles from previous years. And the Guinness Book of World Records is always here, as we can imagine. It continues to. And there's one Canadian bestseller in the overall top nonfiction, Canadian authored book in the top nonfiction. 2020 fiction bestsellers. 3 Reese's book club picks in the top 10 this year. And again, we often see John Grisham in here, but a good cross section of the industry in 2020. So how do the subjects break down? Not a lot of change year over year. As I mentioned, juvenile was up a little bit and nonfiction was down a little bit when compared to overall. So we've seen a steady increase in juvenile over the last years, up almost 5% in the last 5 years, so almost a percentage point per year. When we saw it again this year. So it continues to grow up that juvenile YA portion continues to grow considerably. Another way of looking at the COVID period, this graph shows the weekly unit sales for the top level BISAC subject categories for the first 31 weeks in 2020. The impact of the COVID-19 retail closures can be seen again here, but note the performance of the juvenile and young adult titles throughout the retail closure, which is the gray line kind of at the top there. While they did go down slightly, they didn't go down nearly as much as the other subject categories during the COVID time. And this is because the education category pulled a lot of it up. It's also interesting to look here at what Mother's Day does to fiction sales, pulling that category back up a little bit throughout the retail closure. So the performance of the market wasn't equal across all the subject categories. So here's a focus in on education. So the purple line with the large peaks in it, that's education sales for 2020. So you can see the large growth in books in the education category picking up when the lockdown first started, kind of in the mid to end of March, and then again late summer. And so, children were coming home from school, there was school shutdowns, and so there was a huge growth in the purchase of educational content to help with homeschooling or learning at home. A lot of this category was dominated by curriculum type books through the year. So education saw a 74% growth year over year. The other categories in the nonfiction area that did very, very well year over year were games, again, another pandemic related area, crafts, which I've mentioned before, and biography. Also interesting to look at travel, which saw a downward trend. So you can see the purple line there going down around the middle of March when the lockdown went in. Obviously, people were not traveling, and throughout the whole year, there wasn't a lot of travel. We did see some slight tick-ups in local and regional travel guides selling throughout the year, and as things got a little bit better towards the summer, midsummer, the numbers definitely came up, but they weren't anywhere near where they would normally be, and they were the year before that. In the fiction category, fiction women, a subcategory based on BISAC, had a huge increase. Also, thrillers were up and literary fiction was up. We also covered some very niche subject trends on the blog this year. In the case of Instagram Meets Reality, book sales for titles about bread and bread making saw a significant sales bump, growing 69% in the first 8 weeks of the pandemic, and a significant bump for books about chess as well, following the October 23rd premiere of The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. We also recently updated our coverage of sales of Instagram famous poets and celebrity poets, with Instagram famous poets making up approximately 42% of all poetry sales last year. Celebrity poets are growing in prominence in the category as well, making up under 1% at the start of the year, but making significant gains through the fall. So lots of external impact on the book industry as always, and what is selling and what consumers are looking for. And just briefly, the US numbers, this is from NPD BookScan, saw their largest increase since 2010 in physical book sales in the US, and they saw an increase of 8.2% in physical book sales in the US. The one thing I wanted to touch on, there wasn't just the retail closures impacting the market. Publishers and book suppliers were dealing with supply chain challenges and also making decisions on whether to release new titles into a marketplace that was not a traditional marketplace. And by that, I mean that stores were not open. And as we've already mentioned, stores are a huge discovery mechanism. And if stores are not open and people can't go into stores and browse, it's a completely different discovery model awareness model than has been in other years. So what we saw was the supply chain challenges and these discovery kind of awareness creating store closure impact had an impact on what was being released in the market as well. So what we're seeing here is the number of print book ISBNs being released into the market each month through 2020. So the orange line is 2020. The dashed kind of gray line is the average of the last 2 years, 2018 and 2019, of ISBNs and print book ISBNs released into the market. So you can see the downward trend through the start of the pandemic. When stores started to close, publishers started to pull books from the marketplace or pull release dates or delay release dates. And we talked to a lot of publishers. We know that they were doing this because they couldn't tour authors and lots of other things like that. So there was a lot going on at that period. We also don't see the bump in May and June that we often see in the summer. So this impacted what was selling as well. There was less books available for consumers to buy, and therefore less for them, less sales to happen. So something we're keeping an eye on as well going forward into 2021. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and look at our Canadian book consumer survey. So in 2020, we surveyed 12,000 adult English-speaking Canadians to find 2,750 book buyers and surveyed them on 6,000 purchase decisions that they made. So the top level data from this survey gives us a good view of what's going on in the marketplace throughout the year. We survey quarterly, as I mentioned, in March, September, June, and December. So what formats were consumers buying in 2020? Well, they were buying formats that they often buy. So we did see a slight uptick in the two digital formats. Audio is the blue line on the bottom, and ebooks are the yellow line. So both of those saw slight upticks. You can see the 6%, 19% year over year. What's not evident on this graph is that in the first two quarters, Q1 and Q2 of 2020, these two numbers were quite a bit higher than they normally are. So we were seeing ebook numbers up around 26 and 27% of purchases, and audio remained relatively flat through that time. So again, when stores were closed and libraries were closed, people needed to get books, and they went with some digital formats, but this leveled out throughout the year. So those are the formats they bought. Where did they get them? This is very interesting. So the blue line is online book sales, and this is the last 5 or 6 years. Physical is the red line, and this is done by quarter. So we can see when in Q4 of 2019, we were about 50-50. And then Q1, remember the survey was done at the end of March, we saw this huge jump in online purchasing. So online purchasing went to almost 70% of all the books being purchased from our panel in that quarter. It came down a bit as stores opened again, but we ended up in 2020 with about 65% of books being purchased from our panel being done online. And this is across all formats. So this includes the digital formats, print and digital formats. And remember, much of the purchasing last year, even if it was being done through independent stores, was actually the purchase was done online. So a consumer would go online, purchase the books, and they may still go do curbside pickup, or they may do delivery. So when we look just at the consumer channels, broken down a little bit differently, again, we can see this overall online, 2020 is the red line and blue line is 2019. We can see 65% of purchases happened online. When we look at bookstores, purchases went from 35% of all of our purchases down to 23%, and general retail, which remained open through much of the pandemic, grew 1% year over year. So we've looked at how consumers bought their books and where they bought their books. How did they become aware of the books that they purchased? There wasn't a massive change year over year in awareness that resulted in purchase, but there was some changes. So the number one way that that book buyers told us that they discovered the books that they purchased was by reading books from previous books by the author of previous books in the series. And there was no change in that year over year, and that's the 25% you see there on the screen. Reviews and recommendations are the next one. They were 20% of book purchases had that checked. That grew 8% year over year, and that may be related to the social media we talked a little bit about, or not being able to browse, which is the next one. 18% of purchases had browse and search checked as part of the awareness creator, and that only grew 1% year over year, and that may be related to store closures again. Bestseller lists accounted for 10%, and that was a 2% year over year growth. And social media accounted for 10% of purchases as well, and that was a 4% growth year over year, fairly significant growth. And we saw it again in the reading data at the start of this presentation as well. When we look specifically at formats, ebooks awareness is created through email alerts and newsletters. They're really important as a discovery mechanism or awareness creator for ebook purchases. Previews and samples are also really important for ebooks. Bestseller lists are less important for ebook purchases. And audio is kind of spread out across a wide range of discovery or awareness creators. But podcasts are hugely important for audiobook purchases, as is social media. And again, previews and samples are very important for audiobooks as well. So that's our consumer data at a high level. I'm just going to pivot quickly and talk a little bit about library data. So similar to our sales data project, we have now started to collect circulation data from public libraries for physical books in Canada. We did launch this project on April 1st, 2020, so right in the heart of the pandemic, which is a little unfortunate, but it does allow us to measure what happened in libraries a little bit. So we have not all of the public libraries in Canada, but we have a good cross-section, a good regional breakdown of public libraries across Canada. So as has already been mentioned, and as you probably already know, libraries, like retail outlets, mostly closed around March 16th, 2020. And so here, like the sales data charts I showed earlier, here are the loans, which is the blue line kind of in the middle. These are the loans of physical books from the public libraries reporting to our library data service. So you can see the huge drop off in March there as libraries closed for in-store pickup or for in-library pickup, and the impact that that had on the library sector. So this is January to January, January 2020 to January 2021. But again, things did start to pick up about the same time as the retail outlets, maybe a teeny bit later. In July or so, the libraries started to do curbside pickup, and they did much better in physical book loans. And things have gotten a little better every week since then. And the last 52 weeks, this is April to April, things are looking a little bit better. Now, this is just physical books. We do not have digital circulation data from the public libraries, but everything we've heard from public libraries is that digital circulation went through the roof during this period. And we see that also, as I mentioned already, in our reading data and our other data. One of the things that library data allows us to do is create most loaned or most read books, most loaned. So here are the most loaned Canadian books overall in 2020. These often trail a little bit what the best-selling lists are that we get from sales data. There was only one title that was in the most loaned for 2020 that was also in the best-selling titles for 2020, and that was Jessie Thistles from the Ashes. So congratulations, Jessie. Looking again at our consumer data a little bit, remember this is 12,000 adult English-speaking Canadians. 35% of our respondents said they visited a public library last year, either online or in person, and 32% of respondents borrowed a book of some format from a public library. Again, this is from our consumer data. We saw a slight decline in the number of people borrowing a print book, and then a slight increase in the number of people buying an ebook. This is the number of people, not the number of borrows. When we look at by format, this is the number of checkouts from our 12,000 people that said they checked out books from the library. There was about 3,700 people that said they checked out books from the library. So 80% of the checkouts in 2019 were in print, but that was down to 63% in 2020. While ebook jumped from 13% of checkouts all the way up to 27%, and we saw a slight increase in audiobook checkouts from 7% to 10%. So looking back at the previous chart, we didn't see huge growth in the number of people shifting formats, but we did see a large growth in the number of checkouts of from the people who were already reading those formats. When we look at the average borrows from our 3,700 library borrowers in a given month, on average, a library user borrowed 2.8 print books, 1.2 ebooks, and 0.5 audiobooks. Print books was down slightly from 3.4 print books per month. Ebook was up significantly from half a book to 1.2, and audio was up slightly from 0.3 to 0.4. So definitely more digital in 2020, and this was notably higher, as I mentioned, in the sales as well in quarters 1 and 2, but shifted, leveled out again throughout the year. But definitely a significant growth in digital. We can also lay BISAC subject categories over our library checkout data to have a look at what's going on there. And you can see the massive jump in fiction lending that happened kind of at the start of the pandemic. Maybe people wanted to get escapist fiction. Hopefully they weren't getting dystopian fiction, but maybe they were. So big growth. And just an interesting course juxtaposition against the BISAC subject categories we saw earlier for the sales data. So I said I would mention 2020. So this is the first quarter of this year. So this is January just to the end of March, just a week or two ago, depending on when you're watching this. So this is the first quarter of this year. We were up 3% in units over last year. You can see the impact of the pandemic on last year's sales in the yellow line, but not seeing the same impact this year. Good. Obviously, it remains to be seen what will happen with the rest of the year. You're gonna have to stay tuned and see what's going to happen. But so far this year, not at all being impacted in the same way as we were by the pandemic last year. It seems like consumers and retailers and publishers have adapted somewhat to the new reality and are managing to get books out to consumers. So in summary, that's a lot of data. So as is usual, we just threw a lot of data and graphs at you in a short period of time. Hopefully it wasn't overwhelming. 2020 was overwhelming. But it was definitely an interesting year for the book industry in Canada. Retail and library closures, supply chain issues, remote working, and many other challenges had and continue to have a huge impact on the industry. If there was one thing that stood out for me in 2020, it was the resilience of the industry. From stores and libraries moving almost 100% online and adding local and curbside delivery to publishers and authors moving fully to virtual events, the industry had an all right year, all things considered. Like many areas of our lives, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation of how we engage with readers and book buyers. People still want books in whatever format, and that is a very good thing. And with that, I'd like to finish with just a few reminders. So this data and much of the other data will be coming out in reports. So out right now is our Canadian Book Market 2020 yearly annual. You can get that off the BookNet Canada website. Later this spring, we'll be releasing the leisure data in a full report. Stay tuned and subscribe to our newsletter for more information about that. A little later in the spring, we have an update to our 2018 study on diverse content and reader demand for diverse content. We've done a new survey for that, so that'll be available. And we've also been releasing much of the consumer data to our blog. So go have a look there. There's lots more buyer and borrower behavior data being released for free to our blog. I'd also like to remind everyone that this is just one of many tech forum sessions that are being pushed out this spring. There's a broad range of topics available all from the techforum.booknetcanada.ca site. Also, we have over 10 years of BookNet programming from Tech Forum. Lots of interesting sessions available from this year and previous year's Tech Forum program available on the Tech Forum website and on our YouTube channel. Go check some of them out and stay tuned for more educational programming on our podcast, our blog, and if you are not already subscribed to our newsletters, I urge you to subscribe to our newsletters as we will be releasing our calls out to new research that we publish there. So with that, thank you, everyone, for tuning into this presentation. Hope it was educational. Hope you enjoyed. Stay safe and read lots of books.